Rabbi say, last week we talked about tzaddik. We finally had finished describing the soul, the dynamics, the complexities of what a neshama are. And we talked about the nature of the struggle, the nature of the war between the godly and animal souls. And we talked last week about the tzaddik. And I defined tzaddik for you. I wanted to find a comprehensive and a distinct, a concise definition for the term. And I told you tzaddikim are inspired people. That was the phrase that we used. Inspired people. And when you're inspired, regular things are not a big deal. And that's the definition of a tzaddik, because he's an inspired person or she's an inspired person. Regular Yiddishkeit's not the issue. The issues are deeper, more personal, more pneumistic. And we also touched on the perfect tzaddik, who's essentially not a human being. It's a completely different kind of an existence altogether. Today we're going to talk about the Rasha. Okay, now we've invented a very, very, very diplomatic, a PC, a politically correct word for Rasha. We call the Rasha the repeating Baal Tshuva. That's how we refer to the Rasha. You know, it's like the person who's on a diet between meals. So the Rasha is a repeating Baal Tshuva. And sometimes he's repeating not that often, sometimes he's repeating quite often, sometimes he's repeating incredibly often. But this is what we deal with the Rasha. Chapter 11 is one of the shortest chapters in the Tanya. But Rebbe devotes to the Rasha. And here too, I want to give you a concise definition, a very, very, very narrow, very, very short, comprehensive definition. And the definition of the Rasha that I'm using is he's a compromised person.
But he's not the repeated Baal A Rasha is a repeated Baal somebody who's struggling and trying. He's a Baal He's trying to do the right thing, but he's not a Rasha. A Rasha, somebody is doing it on purpose, or he doesn't.
We are learning Tanya. And Tanya is offering us mystical definitions to Tzaddik Ben Rasha. And within the framework of the Tanya, that's exactly what a Rasha is. A Rasha is not a bad person. A Rasha is not a failure of a person. A Rasha is a compromised person. In other words, a Rasha is a person who's not winning 100% of the time. He may be winning 99% of the time, maybe winning 98% of the time, maybe winning 51% of the time, or 90%, 10% of the time. But the definition of a Rasha is a compromised person.
But that's most of the people.
Yes, that's most of the people. You see, there are the standard definitions of Tzaddik Ben Rasha, which you know. Tzaddik Ben Rasha, according to the standard definitions, are people who are defined simply by what they do. A tzaddik is more than 50% good, a Rasha is more than 50% evil, and a Bein is 50-50. In the Zohar, we have different definitions. Where a tzaddik is somebody whose Yetzer Hara is bent towards the Yetzer Tov. As I described it to you last week, he's an inspired person. And a Rasha is a person whose Yetzer Tov is bent towards the Yetzer Hara. That means he's practically compromised. The frequency of the compromise is less of the issue in terms of the fundamental definition. Right. What makes a Rasha is simply the fact that he's compromised. Now, before we get fancy, let's be simple. Nobody likes to be called the Rasha. Why? Because Rasha means a bad person, right? In convention, Rasha means an evil person, right? Some would say that Rasha is actually the letters Ra with a shin in the middle for whatever reasons. And this is part of what you have to get used to. When you learn the Tanya, is that in the model of the Tanya, in the lexicon of the Tanya, a Rasha is not bad. In the classic model, a Rasha is bad. In the Tanya, the Rasha is simply a person that Einay Mizgaber al Atzmai. He's not a complete master over himself. He's not winning 100% of the time. And as you so correctly said, that's many people, or most people, are in that category, compromised people. And this is one of the things you have to get used to when you learn the Tanya. As I've told you repeatedly, that the censor of the Tanya, he wasn't a Jew. He was a guy in Vilna. He was a smart guy, very learned, he knew Hebrew. And he looked over the Tanya and approved its publishing in Tsarist Russia. And when asked why he approved the Tanya, he said, because this book removes the child from the world. The thing about the Tanya is that it doesn't allow you to fool yourself. The Tanya is very honest, and the truth hurts. But on the other hand, the truth is very, very, very real. Rasha in the language of the Tanya is not a bad person. Rasha is the language of the Tanya, a person who's not winning 100% of the time. Now, the tzaddik is an inspired person. When a person is inspired, winning, in other words, not being compromised is not an issue. When you're an inspired person, you do the right thing and you don't do the wrong thing because you're inspired. The Rasha is uninspired. But not being inspired alone does not make you a Rasha. You can be uninspired and not be compromised. To be uninspired and not compromised, which we're going to be talking about in Mitzvah next week, we call that Beinani. He's an uninspired person, but he's not compromised, which means to say he realizes that when I'm inspired, I have more power. When I'm inspired, I have more energy, I have more ability to win. When I'm uninspired, I lack that enthusiasm, I lack that energy, I lack that will. And therefore, the Beinani, the uninspired person who doesn't want to be compromised, compensates for his lack of inspiration with self-control, with Kabbalah Seil. What makes a person a Rasha in the model of the Tanya is that he's compromised. Compromise means to say he's uninspired. At least he's periodically uninspired. He's not perpetually, he's not constantly, he's not contiguously in the state of passion and inspiration. And as a result, he goes through spells where he is, for all intents and purposes, in a spiritual drought. And when you're in a spiritual drought, you don't have power. And you have to survive. And if you don't survive, you compromise. That's all. The Eibusher tells us what to do. Hashem gives us mitzvahs. Hashem tells us how we're supposed to behave. Hashem tells us how we are not supposed to behave. And when we don't have the ability to win 100% of the time, we're compromised. We're weak. We're diminished. Now this is a condition which we don't have to read about in books or even in magazine articles, or even on the internet magazines. This is a condition that all we need to do is take a look in the mirror. And we understand full well what it means to compromise people. Because we're all compromised. We all have, I shouldn't say we're all, many of us are compromised. Some of us have smaller compromises, others of us have bigger compromises. And let me put it to you in psychological terms rather than religious terms. We find ourselves incapable of doing what we want ourselves to do. Not what Hashem wants us to do, we want ourselves to do. We find ourselves incapable of not doing things that we don't want to do. That's what compromise means. I mean, the best example in my personal life about compromise is called snooze. S-N-O-O-Z. It's a small little button that comes on the modern clock, and snoozes begemati yetzahare in Latin. You set the clock for 5 o'clock because you want to get up at 5 o'clock. And you don't get up at 5 o'clock, it's not a big deal. You're not going to get fired, you're not going to lose your job, the world's not going to come to an end. But it's a sign of compromise. I don't have the strength to do what I wish to do. If I didn't want to get up at 5 o'clock, I should not have set the clock for 5. I should have set it for 5:15, for 5:30, for 5:45. If I set the clock for 5 o'clock, I want to get up at 5. My inability to make myself do what I want to do is called compromise. Now, we forgive ourselves, and it's not so terrible to forgive ourselves. The Alter Rebbe is simply saying the fact. That's what Rasha means. Rasha does not necessarily mean bad. It certainly doesn't mean evil. It means compromise. It means weak. Now, before I even go into the particulars of Rasha, I want to give you a piece of information which is critical to the Hasidic way of thought and to Yiddishkeit. And I think that Lahavel, even just in a human sense, it has credibility. In other words, even without Yiddishkeit, this has basis. One of the things that's discussed a lot in the model of a Hasidic life as it conforms to the structure of the Tanya is the idea of iskafia. Iskafia means essentially self-control, discipline. And the essence of iskafia is not to give in to temptation. Now, some temptations are bad. Some temptations are wrong. Some temptations are signs of weakness. Right? All temptations feel good. Iskafia means not to give into temptation. Of course, the temptations you least want to give into are temptations that are bad. And of course, and so forth. A temptation which is not good is not so terrible. A temptation which is a sign of weakness is even less severe, like our good friend chocolate. Right? There's a little passage in the Hayom Yom which says it all. It's talking about the Alter Rebbe's Chassidim, the Chassidim of the Alter Rebbe, who were really ideal Chassidim. In other words, they actually practiced what the Alter Rebbe preached. There was no messing around. And they all understood the idea of not allowing themselves temptations that are legitimate, that are kosher, completely permitted, based on a concept called bittul hataiva. The literal translation of the words bittul hataiva means to break temptation. But what it really means, bittul hataiva, means to gain control of our natural weakness. In Chassidus, in Tanya chapter 27, and at our pace it takes about 27 weeks to get there, there's a discussion about iskafia. Iskafia means it's kosher and I don't want to have it. I'm not going to allow myself to do it. There's religious reasons for iskafia. There are holy reasons. There are sacred reasons for a person not eating kosher food because they enjoy it and so forth. But there's also very practical reasons. And the practical reason is, if life is about not being compromised, and of course in the model of the Tanya, compromise means Rasha. Because remember, we're not defining Rasha as an evil person. We're just defining a Rasha as a weak person who gives into weakness, even if it's infrequently. The tzaddik is inspired, and the Rasha is uninspired. But in addition to being uninspired, the Rasha is weak. How frequently is he weak? It could be once in a month, it could be once in a week, it could be every day, it could be once in a year, it could happen one time in his life. The key is that Rasha has weakness. How do you react? How do you offset weakness? How do you fortify yourself? How do you make yourself so strong that you're never weak? How does a person put themselves into a position that when the alarm rings at 5 o'clock, they get up? Day after day after day. It's not simply because you've gotten enough sleep or because you're organized enough. It's about a mastery over self. And the Alter Rebbe's Chassidim understood that they need to put themselves through a regime. They have to force themselves to put themselves into a position where they break the whole tendency of weakness. And the beginning of the tendency of weakness is temptation. We're not talking about sin. We're just simply talking about temptation. Not all temptation is sin. You know, some temptation can be sometimes linked to mitzvahs also, but it's temptation. So they had this concept that they have to break the temptation tendency. How? By not giving into it. And bittul hataiva was one of the first steps in being a real chassid. Because being a real chassid means not being compromised. Not being compromised means not losing even once in a while. And they understood that in order to be able to achieve this, they have to gain mastery over themselves. In order to gain mastery over themselves, they cannot just stop themselves when a temptation comes along. They cannot just win a war when the war happens. They need to fortify themselves. They need to make themselves strong people. So they developed a philosophy that says, anything I want, I'm not going to have. There's nothing wrong with it. It's not a sin. If it's wrong, I don't want it. Why? Because I want to become a strong person. And a strong person means I want to become a master over the one person, the one thing I can actually control, which is myself. And they devoted their lives to breaking the weakness tendency that we all have. You know, one of the great Shmuel Munkus stories, Shmuel Munkus was a chassid of the Alter Rebbe. And he was the jester. He was the comic. He was the guy who made everybody laugh. Ha ha. Shmuel Munkus was a very, very great chassid. Shmuel Munkus may have been a tzaddik, may have been the inspired person we talked about before. Shmuel Munkus, the previous Rebbe once by Fabrengen said, when you say Shmuel Munkus, it's okay to say Reb Shmuel Munkus. Eliyahu Hanavi would visit him. Elijah the prophet would visit him. Now Elijah the prophet meets me too, visits me also. The only problem is, not only you don't know about it, I don't know about it either, you understand. Shmuel Munkus is a big Baal Madrega. So there's a great Shmuel Munkus story. It's one of those stories everybody tells and laughs. But it's a deep story. There was a Chassidish Fabreng. And all the Chassidim were sitting around. And of course, at a fabrengen, you drink and you speak and you eat, right? We're sitting at a fabrengen, and the food ran out. So somebody says, let's see who has, the butcher lived nearby. And butchers in those days, the shaykhet, not the butcher, the ritual slaughterer, he didn't have a lot of money, but part of the way that he was paid for his services as a shaykhet was certain parts of the animal. I mean, the most delectable parts of the animal went to the butcher. The lungs, the spleen, and maybe the brain. I mean, the parts that everyone was dying to eat. And the lungs, like chewing gum without flavor. I mean, lungs in America go in the garbage. But in the old country, they would cook them. Just like cook them for like a few days for the rubbery quality to go out of it. So the shaykhet got the lung as a bonus, as a compensation for the shechita. Now, how are you going to eat a lung? I mean, a lung is huge. So they come to the wife, to the butcher's house. He isn't home. And his wife says, here, she had gibrot in the lung. She knew how to prepare it. And she gave it to them. They go she brings it back to the base mother. She put it down on the table. And it looked good, you know what I'm saying? And somebody is eyeing it, and he's reaching for it. And Shmuel Munkis quickly grabs it, and he pulls the entire tray to himself. It's sitting in front of him. Now, nobody wants to look like a glutton and like a grub young, but would you take a piece and pass it? You know, and he's holding it. So somebody actually asks him for it, and he says, no, let it stay here for a while. So then somebody reaches for it. Someone reached for it, he grabbed it. So it was a little tug of war. So he held it like this here. He's embracing this platter of lung. And then people sort of lost their inhibition, and they lost their sense of self, and they started to engage. So he gets up, and he goes away from the table, and they chase him. So he starts to dance around the room, holding this platter of lung, and eventually they corner him. He was right next to the garbage can, and the garbage can didn't look exactly like my garbage can and your garbage can, and the whole lung went into the garbage can, and it was insoluble. There was no way you were going to get it. You couldn't salvage that lung. Unsalvageable. So they got very upset. They don't understand. We want to eat. They don't let us eat. And he's in the greatest of moods. So they tell him, we're going to whip you. So he lays down on the table, says, by all means. So they get a belt and they give him a few pets. He climbs off the table like nothing happened, and he sits down, and the Fabrengen goes on. 15 minutes later, the wife of the sheikh is running in, screaming if they ate the lung. It was treif. It was treif. Shmuel Munkis had Ruach HaKodesh. He knew he was a spiritual person. And the room goes silent, stunned. You understand? Now this is another Shmuel Munkis, the Alter Rebbe's comic, the Alter Rebbe's jester. And they turn to him and say to Shmuel, Pravas Kunzen, you're doing tricks. Chassidim used to call miracles tricks. Pravas Kunzen, miracles, Ruach HaKodesh. He saved them off meeting treif. He says, not a trick. He says, how do you know it was treif? He says, I didn't know it was treif. Believe me, he knew it was treif. But it's what he said. He says, why do I say? He says, when I was with the Alter Rebbe the first time, he told me, anything you want very much, don't have. When they brought in that long, I wanted it like my life depended on it. I decided that I'm not supposed to have it. And then I discovered everybody else wants it as much as I. So nobody should have it. So I threw it in the garbage. So they put him back on the table and they gave him Weiterschmitz for his Ruach HaKodesh. But they whipped him a little different, and he was whipped by different people. This is a story. Now, I don't think it's such a far out stretch to say that Shmuel Munkis felt that it was treif. I mean, many Allah Khalid can feel, a really, really pious Jew can feel, an inspired person can feel not kosher. But the purpose of the story is to bring out this idea that the Alter Rebbe would encourage his Chassidim. You want something, don't have it. This is not just about deprivation and morbidity. It's about shviras hatayva. It's breaking the entire temptation component of our lives. We're not talking about sin necessarily. We're talking about weakness. Because weakness is the reason for compromise. The reason we don't win 100% of the time is because we eat chocolate. Now, what does chocolate have to do with winning? It has to do with developing character, right? That's the holy word, right? That's the word that's used always in politics. Character. And you develop character not when you have a test. When you have a test, you cannot win. You develop character by living a certain type of life. Now, I want to say something very, very carefully over here. This has to be carefully monitored. You can't become a recluse who eats bread and water, because you'll go insane. The Alter Rebbe's Hasidim were not ordinary people. To never allow yourself a temptation, it's a standard, it's a status, but to be very, very careful not to destroy yourself in the process. In other words, life in general, and Avodah Pnimis, working on character in particular, needs guidance. It's a very personal, very individual exercise. And you can't just, I heard that the Alter Rebbe's chassid never ate chewing gum, so I won't eat chewing gum. Life doesn't begin and end with not eating chewing gum. Life in general, and Yiddishkeit and Avodah in particular, are very personal. So if you're taking what I'm saying seriously, how to implement this is not, some would say, Iskaf in our generation is not what you eat, it's what you say. And it's very credible. Control the temptation to babble. And you'll gain a considerable amount of self-control. But anyway, having said that, this is the essence of a Rasha. A Rasha is a person who is accustomed to allowing himself temptation. And as a result, he fails tests. Doesn't matter how frequently. And if a person wishes to be not a Rasha, in other words, a person wishes to be not compromised, meaning to say, practically speaking, that when they set themselves to do something, they do it. When the Eibusha says no, it's no. And when the Eibusha says do it, they listen, and they're on time. And there's no equivocating, and there's no failure. It doesn't begin and end with those acts. It begins and ends with who you are as a person. And this is the essence of the Rasha. The Rasha, practically speaking, is a compromised person. In other words, he loses some of his battles to the Yetzer Hara, about sin, about omission, the sins of commission, the sins of omission, meaning I missed a chance to daven, I missed an opportunity to do another person a favor. The root of that is weakness. Weakness about things that are by themselves not sin. And therefore, the struggle that we discussed before is not simply a struggle of not sinning, it's a struggle of developing character, it's a struggle of iskaf, it's a struggle of fortifying, strengthening ourselves by, at least in a small way, not allowing ourselves some temptation for the express purpose of strengthening our character. So our chapter is about the Rosh. At your own risk.
Could it become more pleasure of denying yourself than having it?
Anything could become.
How does a person know when he crossed that line? When he gets more pleasure out of denying it?
The reality of what we're discussing really requires, if not a counselor, a good friend. When you decide to buy a car, you consult a person. When you decide to buy a house, you consult a whole bunch of people who know how to charge. When a person wants to do Inyan Pnimi, want to work on character, you certainly need somebody else to consult. And if you can't find somebody who's in a position to teach, at least you need a good friend. And those are the kinds of things you want to look out for. You want to look out for creating a monster, creating a new idol, the idol of piety, and you also want to look out for the devil in all of this, and that's depression. The risk in taking yourself this seriously is becoming so caught up in yourself that you fall into a sadness and a depression, and that's not allowed to occur. Give in to your temptations, don't fall, because when you fall into a depression, you're never more you're never weaker, you're never more compromised. People sin most of the time when they're weak, not when they're tempted. Temptations are all over the place, but weakness, emotional weakness, makes us the fodder for temptation, makes us easy pickings. And weakness, one of the critical forms of being weak is being emotionally weak. So you don't do these kinds of disciplines. You try to get someone to at least listen and understand your opinions, your struggles. But understand that we're not talking philosophy here. We're talking about life. So Rabbi talks about the Rosh. And he says there's so many different levels of Rosh. In general, there's two categories of Rosh. Just like last week, we talked about two categories of tzaddik. So this week we're talking about two categories of Rosh. The two categories of tzaddik we talked about last week were the inspired person who's still human, who's struggling, and the inspired person who's not human at all. He has absolutely no evil within him, and he exists either to elevate the world or to bring God into the world, as we discussed. The same is true of Rasha. Rasha means a compromised person. There's two categories of Rasha. A Rasha who is compromised and has a conscience, and a Rasha who's a compromised person who has no conscience anymore. That's called a perfect Rasha, a comprehensive Rasha. He's perfected the condition of compromise. He has absolutely no guilt. He doesn't care. He has absolutely no remorse, no sense of this is wrong and I shouldn't be doing this. He's beyond regret. He's beyond feeling bad for himself. These are two categories of Rasha. So pardon? They're not extremes. They're gradations. Because there's a lot of steps. A lot of steps. The extreme would be the inspired Jew versus the person who has no feelings. The perfect tzaddik and the perfect Rasha. Those are extremes. We're dealing with uninspired people who are compromised, right? You can be uninspired and not compromised. That's Beinoni. Inspired is tzaddik. Compromised is Rasha. Rasha doesn't mean I'm weak, I give in to my weakness. So the Rabbi says there's so many levels of giving in. A person give in to his weakness one time. A person give in to his weakness in the smallest ways. Now we look at such a person and say, wow, is he holy? Is he pious? Is he righteous? But that's not how he should view himself. Because of course, Avodas Hashem, spiritual growth, connection to God is very personal. And if a person is so close to self-control that compromise to them means failing, to think a bad thought. How terrible is think a bad thought? You think a bad thought once in a year. You're a pretty holy person. But if you're that person to yourself, that's compromise. That's Rasha. Speak bad words. Do a bad action. Miss an opportunity to a bad deed. So Alter Rebbe says there's incredibly great variety of different levels of Rasha. Some Rashaim are very disciplined, have an enormous amount of self-control, and are compromised infrequently. From time to time they lapse. From time to time it can be once in a life, once in a year, once in a month. And then of course there are people who are far more compromised, which means to say that they're much more easily weak and allow themselves to do things that they don't want to do things that are wrong, which are against the Torah, against their own judgment, their own will, because of the whole temptation issue that we talked about before. So there's various different levels of Rasha. So if a person is a Rasha, that means that they're practically compromised, and the frequency of their compromise is very, very low, which is an incredible. Can you imagine being that disciplined? Once in 3 months you think something you shouldn't think, or say something you shouldn't do. To us, that's an incredible madrega. It's a big tzaddik. To themselves, it's weakness. So what they have to do is tshuva. A person who sins more frequently. Now, I don't like to use the word sin because it frightens people away. So we'll use political correct terms like compromised. People who are compromised more frequently. And again, listen to how I'm defining it. It's not just God told you and you're not listening. You said to yourself and you didn't listen. You made for yourself a standard and didn't maintain it. That's the key to Rasha. Rasha means I am not capable of doing what I want to do. I'm not capable of disciplining myself about something which I want to discipline myself. This is not philosophy. This is life for the vast majority of human beings. It's not about I shouldn't have done it because I got caught. I shouldn't have done it because God said. I shouldn't have done it because I feel like a piece of garbage. I don't like myself. And yet we're weak. So the Rasha is doing tshuva. The Rasha is doing tshuva. Now sometimes the tshuva helps. What does tshuva help mean? You don't repeat the offense. And sometimes the tshuva becomes a revolving door. And this is the condition that so many of us find ourselves in so frequently. The Alter Rebbe employs a Mameh Chazal. He quotes a rabbinic statement that says, quote, Rishayim Maleim Charatis. The trademark of a Rasha is constantly regretting what he did. The trademark of a compromised person is, if I had only not done that. And what was the big deal? I could have controlled myself. I could have disciplined myself. It wasn't that big a deal. Why did I have to give in? The same stupid temptation over and over again. I know exactly where it comes from. I know exactly when it's going to come. I'm all prepared. It shows up on the scene. I'm helpless. Control yourself. And this is the condition that so many of us know so well. We're compromised. We care. We want to do the right thing. We feel terrible about it. We fight, and sometimes we win. And every time you win, it's an incredible achievement, and it's an achievement worth celebrating. But so frequently, or from time to time, we give in. We feel terrible about it. And then what do? We give in. And then what do? You feel terrible about it. And then what do? We give in. Sometimes, in fact, the reaction to feeling terrible is doing it again because somehow it makes us feel better. Right? It's called the revolving door. You're going around and around in a circle. This is life for so many people. So many of us. This is the condition that we're in. We constantly feel bad. Here's the upside. We're aware. We're Jewish. We care. Right? Who said that best? We care. Bill Clinton has a monopoly on caring and being sincere. We feel bad. And we look at ourselves and we admit to ourselves that we don't have the ability to prevent it from happening again. People ask this question all the time. I'm asked this question and I'm not comfortable with it because I'm no tzaddik, I'm no beinoni, I'm not perfect. People say, I did something wrong, I do tshuva, and I know I'm going to repeat, I know I'm going to do it again. Who are we kidding? And the Alter Rebbe says, if the tshuva is sincere, if you really don't want to repeat it, and when you say I won't do it again, you mean it, the tshuva has credibility and you don't get punished for it, and it can perhaps even cleanse and so forth. But many of us find ourselves in the revolving door of compromise. Again, I'm using compromise because I don't want to use the word sin, because I want everybody to think that this class is very wonderful. And it's a terrible place to be. And if we're real servants of God, we would like to interrupt it. But for many of us, it's life. For many of us, it's life. So I want to tell you a story. There are several points in telling this story. And I want to talk about this concept of a rasha, of a compromised person doing tshuva. I heard this story from Reb Mendel Futterfass. If you've been to these classes, you heard Reb Mendel Futterfass's name, because he was a very special person. His Fabrengens had a special magic. So, what I know, you have to know. That's just the way the world works. So Reb Mendel would tell the same story again and again. It was one of his stories that he would constantly repeat. Reb Mendel could sit a whole night and entertain hundreds of people and say virtually nothing. That was his genius. He'd sit and he would tell one story, it took him 5 hours, he'd sit there and he was the master of digression and distraction, and it was a class Fabrenga. Reb Mendel is Rabbi Zalman's grandfather, his mother's father.
His mother.
So Reb Mendel has this story about two Yidden who were both Hasidim, but they had taken different paths to Hasidus. One had become a Chassid as a young man, and the other had become a Chassid as an old man, as a senior citizen. They knew each other from childhood. They had learned together in yeshiva, and they were very close friends. A half a century passes, and they're both sitting by the Alter Rebbe. And naturally, a meeting like this was incredibly meaningful and fortuitous. They got together, they hugged, they kissed, and there was a Fabrengen. And of course, everybody was curious to see what these two old mates are going to discuss. And they sat and they talked. So Reuven says to Shimon, one says to the next, tell me, I've been in Chassidus for the last 30 years. Where have you been in the interim? He says, I can summarize my entire life with 4 translations of the word Ashamnu. After we say the Shemona Esrei, after we say the Amidah, after we say the prayer, that we stand, we confess. It's called vidui, confession. And after we do confession, we do what's called tachanun. We plead when we lower our heads. But there's something called vidui, confession. And the structure of the confession is that it follows the order of the Aleph Beis. Oshamnu, Bogadnu, Gazalnu, Dibarnu, Hevinu, Aleph Beis, Gimel Dal Tet Zav. The translation of the word Oshamnu means we have sinned. Now, we can either mean the collective we of the Jewish people, or we could mean all the scattered pieces of ourselves, but let's not get into it. He said, when I was young, I was a student of Satnei Yeshiva. What did I do all day long? We studied Torah and we engaged in religion. And I considered myself quite pious. I considered myself a pretty holy guy. I was not entirely honest of my assessment of myself. But in my view, I was up there amongst the most righteous. Me and Rabbi Hillel and Rabbi Shammai were sort of on the same level.
Wow.
And I would read the vidui, I would read the confession every day, and I would say to myself, why am I saying this? I haven't sinned. I've been sitting in Beis Medrash all day long, praying and learning. And I sinned. So I came to the conclusion that Ashamnu means we sin. It's everybody out there. The handful of us in here, we're not the we. The we is them. They sinned. And I found comfort in that interpretation. Ashamnu means I am confessing for their sins, not for my own sins. As I got wiser, it dawned on me that I was quite arrogant and self-absorbed. Ashamnu means they sinned. How do you know? Did you meet them? And I came to the conclusion means Ashamnu means I know I didn't sin. They didn't sin either. Everybody's righteous. Everybody's pious. You get to know people, you see everybody's wonderful. But then I actually started to study some Musar, some ethics, and I realized how childish, how disingenuous, how self-serving I was being. The analogy for this is very simply, if you want to hit a bullseye every time, you go to a shooting range, first shoot the arrow and then make the circle around it, and you'll always be in the center. If you define righteousness by yourself, you will be righteous no matter what you do. And I finally was able to concede that I'm no tzaddik. I'm not the worst person on the planet, but my opinion of self as this righteous, pious person for whom God has to invent a new Gan Eden is childish. It's ridiculous. It's not credible, and so forth and so on. And I came to the conclusion that Ashamnu means I sinned. Not them, not no one, I. But there was a fundamental weakness in the Ashamnu. When a person confesses, the person says, I did something wrong. What's the problem with that confession? The problem with that confession is the likelihood of him being a repeat offender. So I had to console myself. I said, Ashamnu, I sinned. I'll probably sin again. I feel bad, but I'll probably sin again. I said to myself, I'm compromised, but I'm not a liar. I don't want to. Ashamnu, I've done things that are wrong. In all likelihood, I will do it again. Why? I'm compromised. I feel bad about it, but I'm not going to lie. He says, then I came to Chassid, I came to the Alter Rebbe, I started to learn the Tanya, I learned the Yossi Tshuva. And I learned a brand new definition of Hashem. Not only it's honest, but it's real. I have sinned, and I won't do it again. I will not sin again. I will not repeat it. And the Mendel would finish the story with bang and say, Hashem, ich hab gesündigt und ich hab mehr nicht sündigt, and I won't repeat the sin again. Now, making such a resolution is not even worth the paper it's printed on, as the expression goes, unless there's teeth. You understand? Tshuva can't simply be, I feel bad. I wish I won't do it again. And this is where avodah comes in. When a person is a Baal Tshuva, right? And that's the truth. We are Baal Tshuva. We're not Roshers. We're not sinners. We're compromised people. But we're compromised people with a conscience. We sin, we repent between sins. For some of us, that's a few times a day. For some of us, a few times an hour. For some of us, a week. But you know what I'm saying? It's a revolving door. We're not bad people. We want to do tshuva. What we don't appreciate is that tshuva is not only, I won't do it again. Tshuva is the commitment to the exercise that prevents its repetition. And this is where this idea of bittul ataiva, breaking the temptation, comes in. Learning how to be disciplined in life as a whole is the only way we can be disciplined to protect ourselves against our tendencies towards weakness. I've told you this story before. This is such an incredible story. I was young, and I was a lot smarter than I am now. I've gotten dumb in my old age, and it's good. It's good. It's good. Dumb but honest, or dumb but experienced. I'm not that experienced. I'm not that old, and I'm not that dumb yet. I'll get dumber. But when I was 20, I was a know-it-all. And I knew a person, a firm person, who was quite close to, who had a cocaine problem. They weren't a heavy user. They never ever purchased the cocaine, but they had friends, They ran to the right circles, a firm person. And this person confided in me that they had this weakness with cocaine. Now, I was very young and stupid. And so I asked questions. I never do it by myself. I'll never buy the cocaine. But when I'm in this circle of people and everybody else is being entertained, I entertain myself as well. And then this person offered me an interesting piece of information, which I didn't know. And that is that it's impossible to snort cocaine by itself. It'll kill you. You mix it with a benign substance. I hope I'm not giving anybody an education here. That you can buy over the counter in the drugstore. That dilutes the cocaine. And that's how it's snorted. So I said, I'm sorry? I don't know what it is. Ich weiß nicht. I don't know what it is. I don't think it is baby powder for some reason. So I said to this person, so how do you get a hold of this substance? Oh, I have a supply at home. I said, so throw it out. No, I can't throw it out.
It's too expensive.
It's too expensive, and just in case.
How many years ago was this?
25 years ago?
No idea what he's talking about.
Okay.
What?
Throw it out. No, I'm not going to throw it out. And to me, this was it was a mirror of me. You know, you talk about the fact that you have a weakness. You talk about the fact you want to come to weakness, but you want to hold on to the weakness just for that rare occasion where, you know what, I will allow myself the weakness. This is the realm of the Rasha. And again, we don't want to use the word evil because it makes us uncomfortable. We don't even want to use the word sinner because it makes us quasi-uncomfortable. So we're using the word compromised. Compromise means we do things that are wrong from time to time. And the meaning of the word wrong means things that we don't want to do. I tell myself, don't do it, and I do it. I tell myself, get out of bed, it's 5 o'clock. You know, I can, my snooze, I can program to ring every minute, or every 2 minutes, or every 3 minutes, every 4 minutes. The realm of the Rasha is not simply defined by the sin, by the compromise. It's defined by the cycle of compromise. The cycle of compromise really means even when I'm not compromised, I'm compromised. Because I'm not being genuine about my will, about motivation, about my effort at stopping the cycle of compromise. And the only way to stop the cycle of compromise is through this discipline, through this Kabbalah sale, through taking upon myself discipline, not about the sin itself, but about the whole tendency towards weakness. This is the world of the Rasha, of the compromised person. I want to say one more thing before we go on to the perfect Rasha. And that is, the Alter Rebbe discusses tshuva in Tanya. He mentions it here in chapter 11, which is our topic. And he also visits it again in chapter 17. What does tshuva mean? Tshuva means returning to God. According to Torah, tshuva, which means return to God, is first of all about not being punished. That's the first reason to do tshuva. The first reason to do tshuva is you shouldn't be punished. That's what the Gemara says. Do an aveirus, be punished. You do tshuva, you're not punished. But there are other reasons for tshuva, higher reasons for tshuva, deeper reasons for the tshuva. And they are to become resensitized, to become refined. We understand the model of Rosh. The Rosh is a compromised person. The compromise is measured in actions. But it's the person that's compromised, not just the actions. We are weak. We know we're weak, and in a way we want to stop being weak, but in a way we don't want to give up weakness altogether because it feels good. You know, we want to hold on to it just for the weekends, you know, just from time to time. It's a revolving door of Rosh. It's not like a tshuva is insincere, but it's not with those teeth that say this is not going to happen again. When the Alter Rebbe discusses tshuva, he talks about not just not being punished, but he talks about resensitization. Resensitization means to say the nature of compromise is that it begets more compromise. I don't have to tell you this is common sense. Weakness begets weakness. That's the way it works. When you give in a little, you will give in a little more. You give in a little more. It's just the way it works. That's the nature of the person. When we have an option of being human or animal-like, giving in is animalistic. It's weak. The more we give in, the more likely we are to give in the future. The Alter Rebbe makes the argument that tshuva not just affects that we shouldn't be punished. Theoretically, tshuva can actually end the the cycle and the spiraling out of control and the pattern of weakness begetting weakness, because it actually resensitizes us. It gives us more of a feel, because tshuva is very emotional. When you do tshuva, yes, technically speaking, you're saying to God, I did this and I won't do it anymore, but there's emotion attached to tshuva. And the emotion attached to tshuva, at least in theory, can resensitize the person. In other words, tshuva can actually stop the cycle of repetitive compromise in our practical lives. So Alter Rebbe talks about tshuva being a process by which we can actually become resensitized. The key, however, is commitment. In other words, saying I'm sincere is not the issue. Meaning I'm sincere is not the issue. Doing the work is. In other words, for tshuva to actually be a process by which we don't repeat. Now, I want to tell you something. There is the radical tshuva. There's the extreme tshuva, what we call the hitting rock bottom tshuva. You know, some people just swing from one extreme to the next. When life can't get any worse, you're catapulted into a positive direction. That's the phenomenon of tshuva we see in our times is people completely changing their lives in an incredibly short period of time. That's an extreme kind of tshuva. And to a great degree, that's a gift from God. You cannot ever create enough energy to change your whole life emotionally with tshuva by yourself. God has to inspire that. I teach many types of people, and amongst the people that I teach are Bailei tshuva. I always say and believe that we're all Baal tshuvas. Even those of us born with holy parents, we're a tshuva generation. But I tell people, if you've ever experienced that incredibly extreme leap from the abyss of weakness into incredible empowerment and strength, it's a gift from God. And I say to people, could you visualize doing tshuva with that intensity a second time? You get that once in a lifetime. That kind of unbelievable jump is to do it more than once in a life. The first time God gives it to you. The second time you have to earn it fair and square. That kind of tshuva is incredible. And it's that kind of tshuva that the Gemara says and the Rambam Paskins and the Zohar confirms is higher than a tzaddik. But we don't maintain it. For most of us, tshuva is more involved. It's not this incredible power that just propels us out of weakness into strength and clarity. It's a struggle. And the struggle is not, I don't want to do this anymore. The struggle is not, I won't do it anymore. The struggle is the discipline. The struggle is the work to become a balabayas, become a master over oneself. It's like, it begins with coming 1 minute late to the minyan. What's 1 minute? Understand that the Alter Rebbe proposes that when a person is interested in doing tshuva, and tshuva technically means saying I won't do it anymore. That's the halacha. You say, I won't do it anymore, you're not going to be punished. But the exercise of tshuva, by which one becomes resensitized, it's not simply commitment and sincerity, it's the work of discipline. You'll see in chapter 17 that the Alter Rebbe says you don't even need to have the highest levels of tshuva, even a lower level of tshuva. A person is committed to changing themselves in a particular area of their lives and is prepared to do the work, they can. And we know it. If there's a particular thing in your life which is causing you a lot of trouble, and you say, I got to stop this behavior, it doesn't mean necessarily I'm going to become perfect in every area of my life. But one particular area of your life which you see as so self-destructive, as so bad, you say, I'm going to create the exercises, I'm going to create the discipline necessary for this behavior to be interrupted. Tshuva has the power to reverse the cycle, the tendency, the spiral of compromise, at least in an area. And that's the good news. When the Alter Rebbe wrote his essay on tshuva, people asked the Alter Rebbe, why did he write an essay on tshuva? There's 101 books on tshuva. So he says, all of the books on tshuva that exist describe tshuva as something which is a virtual impossibility. I wanted to demonstrate the reality of tshuva. Tshuva is not only a good philosophy, it's a good practical way of life. So this is the situation with the Rasha, with the compromised person. Go ahead.
There is another way, or maybe it's the same way, but to think about it a different way. It's about desire. Which desire wins over? Desire to do something that makes you weak, or desire to be strong? Whichever desire you let into your life
Of course, what you said
Is
is
it another way, or
it's
it's
a-
another way of thinking about it?
well. Here's the bottom line: if it works, you're a disciplined person. That would work for me from here till I came walked across.
Discipline.
It's exactly the same
Thinking
thing.
about it as my desire is easier than disciplining myself.
You see, but my desire to do the right thing rather than the easy thing is not as simply as desiring it. It takes an incredible amount.
Desire is that's already good.
Okay, well, there's a lot. No. The bottom line is not to do the sin.
Right. But
That's all.
whichever way
And if you don't do the sin, that means you do have strength of character. The mental exercise works if you're a disciplined person.
So it doesn't matter which way I get there.
It's the same. It's the same. It's exactly the same
It's
thing.
okay.
It's exactly the same thing. It's the same thing. The key is you don't do what you have to and not do what you shouldn't because you tell yourself. You do what you have to, not do what you shouldn't because you're strong. And the problem with the Rasha character is that he's weak. He's weak even when he's not doing anything wrong. So it's a cycle. He feels bad, then he feels good, then he feels... He does. But the tshuva, which is about not just feeling bad, but actually changing oneself, it's not such a simple commitment, and then there's the work. And the Alter Rebbe, like I said, the Alter Rebbe's Chassidim were raised with the sense that said, tshuva is not philosophy, and it's not good intentions. Tshuva is the real regaining of mastery over self. I sinned, and I won't sin again. And it doesn't begin with not sinning, it begins with discipline. And that's why I said to you before, that part of the model of Chassidus, of Avodah, by the Alter Rebbe's Chassidim, by Chassidus Bechlal, was bittul atayva. Just don't give yourself what you want, even if it's completely legitimate. Because you want to gain control over yourself. So you have to break the pattern of weakness, which defines so many of us. Right. Now, the Tanya finishes the chapter by talking about the complete Rasha. A complete Rasha is a person who not only is compromised, he doesn't care. It's no longer compromise anymore. It's whatever I want. He doesn't view it as weakness. He has no conscience. He's not doing tshuva. He doesn't feel bad. He just does whatever he wants. There's absolutely no feelings of guilt and remorse whatsoever.
He's called the Rasha, even if he doesn't know, he's doing something wrong. He's still a Rasha. I mean, he's doing something wrong. But on the other hand, he doesn't know.
You're asking a technical question with a lot of emotion. The answer is no. He's not a Rasha. Okay, he's not a Rasha. The problem, however, is when he will discover that he's doing something wrong, because of the predisposition, he just can't become a tzaddik. He's going to have to become a Baal Tshuva, which he has to take to an extreme. A Rasha is a person who has no guilt whatsoever. And I have to tell you like this. Alter Rebbe writes to Tanya, and as I explained to you in one of the more recent classes that we had, he likes to give equal time. For the sake of honesty, he gives the godly soul his time, the animal soul his time. But the Alter Rebbe's equal time is like 100 lines of godly soul and a line and a half of animal soul. That's considered in Alter Rebbe's world equal time. So the whole Rasha gets 4.5 lines. This perfect Rasha gets 4.5 lines. And in those 4.5 lines, he says something positive about him too. The first thing about the Rasha the Alter Rebbe says is he's lost his sense of conscience. He's lost his sense of guilt. He's lost his sense of right and wrong. He doesn't care. A compromised person means I give in to weakness. The root of compromise is weakness. This person doesn't view it as compromise. Doesn't view it as weakness. I'm an animal. Why not? And Alter Rebbe describes it as a person whose neshama has completely been removed from the consciousness of their being. It's the neshama which is the reason for the guilt. The neshama is the reason for the revolving door of tshuva that we're describing. And in the perfect Rasha, the neshama has in effect ceased to assert itself on his consciousness. He doesn't feel the neshama, and as a result he has no feelings of, this is terrible, I shouldn't have done it, and so forth and so on. He's cold. He has absolutely no feelings. And a perfect Rasha is a pretty difficult place to be. Now there are perfect Rashas that are called mummers, mummarim, mummelachis. A mummer is not just an evil person, a sinner. A mummer is a defiant person. A person who's not only doing things that are wrong, but he's got an opinion, he's got an issue. I am going to mock the will of God. I'm going to mock the religion. A mummer is a bad person, is an evil person. A Rasha could be he's just lost his sensitization to such a degree that he has absolutely no feelings. It's a terrible place to be. Now, if a person is a perfect Rasha, they're trapped in their Rashahood, Rashaism, because they have absolutely no motivation to change that circumstance. When they're perfect, the person is less than a perfect Rasha. In other words, they're compromised with an awareness, with a consciousness, so they can walk through the revolving door of Tshuva, Rishayim, Aleim, Charatas, and one day they're going to decide, I'm not doing it anymore. I had an experience in yeshiva, a real story. I sat in Beis Medrash, I'll tell you, now it's probably 300 students. When I was there, it was 45 boys, and we thought it was a big yeshiva. So I sat with my Chavrusa, and next to us was another pair. And our neighbors were in perpetual conversation, always talking. The conversations were quite interesting, because very frequently I was drawn into those conversations. But they didn't learn a Jewish word. Not for a day, for a week, for a month, for a year, for 2 years. They just sat and chatted, and it was a lot of very good stuff. But the title wasn't flying into your head because the Gemara was open. The best conversations are held over an open Gemara. If you ever, in the middle of a conversation, you find it boring, get a Gemara, open it up, and the conversation will suddenly become interesting. So one of the two members of this Chavrusa, I'll never forget, one day got up and says, I'm sick and tired of wasting my time. I want to learn. He took his Gemara and walked away, sat by himself, and he started to study. So it became the biggest joke. Ha ha ha, he's learning. We figured it in the last 15 minutes. This guy hadn't sat in his meditation. He didn't take his nose out of the book for 2 years. He kept it. In other words, it wasn't like he had one of those arousals, one of those moments, He hated himself enough that he wouldn't learn with a study partner, because he knew study partners are the source of all conversation. And he sat and learned for several years from that. I know the guy. I went to yeshiva with him, and he's not somebody I read about in the book. That's called tshuva. That's called resensitizing oneself, breaking the cycle of compromise. A perfect Rosh doesn't have that possibility, because a perfect Rosh has no guilt. So what about a perfect Rosh? How do perfect Roshs do tshuva? So I want to share with you 2 points about this perfect Rosh. The first is mentioned here in the Tanya, and the second is mentioned in other places in the Tanya. As I told you before, the Alter Rebbe likes to offer equal time. The Alter Rebbe likes to offer equal time, but when the Alter Rebbe offers equal time, it's not exactly equal. He gives the perfect Rosh 4.5 lines, and he finds something positive about it. What's the positive thing the Alter Rebbe says about the perfect Rosh? It's the following. The Talmud says that when you have 10 Jews in a room, the Shekhinah is present. The Gemara says, 10 Jews in the room, the Shekhinah is present. It doesn't make a difference, men, women, children, Jews, the Shekhinah is present. Later in the Tanya, and he gets the Kedesh Chav Gimel, in the 23rd letter, which we'll get to in about 22 years, the Alter Rebbe says something interesting, that he heard from his teachers, from the Holy Maggid and the Holy Baal Shem Tov, that if 10 Jews are in a room, doesn't matter what they're doing, and an angel walks in, a malach walks in, he will be overwhelmed with fear because of the presence of the Shekhinah that's there. Because of the presence of the Shekhinah, the presence of God, the light of God, the manifestation of God. So the Alter Rebbe here quotes this Mamach Hazal, indicating very plainly, if you get 10 Roshes, perfect Roshes in a room, but they're Jewish, and perfect Roshes don't exactly discuss religion, and if they do, you don't want to listen to the conversation, it will be very depressing. 10 Roshes come together in a room, the Eibishter is there. Because though it's true that they become so desensitized that the word compromise no longer applies to them, even if you don't want to use the word evil, but they're certainly not, they're beyond compromise, they have no feelings, they're Jewish. And because they're Jewish and have Jewish souls, they have godliness in them, notwithstanding the fact that it isn't conscious. And one of the expressions of it is, you can count them for a minion. The famous story with the Hill of Parich. Hill of Parich was a tzaddik, who was the inspired person we talked about last week. And he was once one person shy of a minion. He had 9 men. He needed a minion. And he was the kind of person, if he didn't get his minion, he would get physically sick. Like he would miss a meal or a night's sleep. He missed a minion, he would get physically sick. So he says to the host, is there any other Jews in the neighborhood? Yeah, there's one guy, but he's a Rosh, he's a Mechal Shabbos, he's a Eichel Treif, he's married to a Goy. Call him. And when he came into Rabbi Hillel, and he told him, I want you to know, I'm a Rosh. And he included him in his minyan. Even though some people would say, not such a good Jew.
Then why did he come if he's such a Rasha?
Because he was complimented by the simple fact that Rabbi Hillel was interested in including him in his minyan. There's an end to the story.
He's already not a Rasha.
Not necessarily. Okay, well, you're a nice lady. And the Tanya said that the Eibishter is a nice Eibishter. 10 Rishoyim, because they're Jewish, Hashem joined in their presence, because a Jew always has a Jewish spark, even if it isn't conscious. And finally, and in conclusion, let me say this one more thing. If a person is a plain Rosh, right, which means a compromised person, and the root of compromise is weakness, they're in a position to do tshuva. If a person is a perfect Rosh, they're beyond compromise and they're beyond awareness of weakness, they just don't care. They too have a possibility for tshuva. In chapter 19, which we'll get to eventually, the Alter Rebbe describes such a personality. And he uses the word galut, exile. He doesn't use this word here, but he uses the word there. Exile means my godly soul has no expression. I've explained this to you many times. The translation of the word exile means I'm stuck in a place and I can't free myself. A captive cannot redeem himself from his own prison. The perfect Rasha's neshama is in exile. There's no expression. Says the Alter Rebbe, when a Jew's raw nerve is touched, and the raw nerve is touched is when you try to touch the place in the Jew where in effect you're saying to the Jew, announce yourself as a non-Jew. Consciously cut yourself off from the identity as a Jew. Something happens. And even a perfect Rasha becomes a fiery lion, becomes an extremely inspired person. As long as you tell a Jew, you keep doing what you're doing, you're still Jewish, you're a Jew at heart, you're a Jew in part, God loves you anyway. When you corner a Jew, who's a complete Rasha, has absolutely no guilt, no conscience, and say to him, do an act that is your declaration to the effect, I am not a Jew, something magic happens. And though we're dealing with a person with zero feelings, a fire is aroused. Because a Jew can't cut himself off from God. He can only convince himself that he's still connected. And even if he's the perfect Rasha with no conscience, someplace he's made peace with himself and told himself, me and God, we've got it figured out. But at the point at which a Jew has to consciously cut himself off from the Eibishter, that line, the Rebbe says, for the most part, a Jew cannot cross. So this perfect Rasha, first of all, he invites the Shekhinah because there's holiness there. And secondly, if you touch the essence, the rawest nerve in a Jew, it emerges. Now, the normal illustration for this is the idea of idol worship. Tell a Jew to worship idols, to worship another God. He cannot do it. But for every person, it's something different. In recent times, the thing that touches the raw nerve is when you tell a Jew to hurt another Jew. To hurt another Jew. What it is that touches that point in a Jew where a Jew has to say to himself, by doing this act, I am severing my link to the Jewish people. For each person, it means something different. And to some people, they convert to a different religion, they can adopt all kinds of other practices, but they can't hurt another Jew. I've told you this before. After the 6-Day War, there was an incredible high rate of divorce amongst intermarried couples. 6-Day War was over 40 years ago. Jews married to Goyim in Texas, in Alabama, in Wyoming, in Hawaii. These were not just assimilated Jews. These were, lost Jews. They had no connection to Jews whatsoever. They married, real wasps, real hot-blooded Americans. And all of a sudden there's a war in Israel and they can't sleep. And their spouse would say to them, what do you have to do with those, with those Zionists? I'm a Jew, so. There were studies done on this. And all of a sudden the spouse realized, I do not know my partner. Why should an event that's occurring 10,000 miles away with a nation with whom he has absolutely no real link matter so much that He's consumed with worry. It's not like he has a passive interest. It's something which is so consuming. Because that event, the 6-Day War, revealed the Pintel Yid like no other since the Holocaust. It sharpened, it brought to the absolute finest point, I'm Jewish. There was an incredible unity in the Jewish world all across the globe at that moment, because it was a moment of incredible fear and incredible crisis, and Jews who had absolutely no identity as Jews were woken up. And this is an illustration of this idea that when you touch the very pintel, the very, very essence of the neshama, even a person with really no feelings, no sentiments, he doesn't consider himself compromised, he considers himself disengaged, and it's aroused. And I'm going to finish with a cute little thing. I was a teenager when I knew even more than when I was 20. I had a chavrusa for Miftzayim. We used to go to put film on people on Friday afternoons. When yeshiva was over, we'd go to Wilshire Boulevard, and we had a route, as it's called. We'd visit different stores, different businesses, and encourage people to do mitzvahs. My chavrusa, my study partner for Miftzayim, was crazy. He was just over the top. I mean, there's nothing he wouldn't do. I'm the reserve type. I'm not the world's greatest salesman, and he has really no fear. And he had this shtick, which I was a witness to, not once or twice, but 100 times, many times. He'd meet people on the street. Now, Wilshire Boulevard is not exactly Kingston Avenue, you understand? Are you Jewish? No, I'm not Jewish. So he had this mishagas. When somebody said they were Jewish, he would say to them, you're not a Jew. And he'd keep walking. Are you Jewish? No, you're not a Jew. And he'd keep walking. Again and again and again, the people would very angrily say, I'm Jewish and leave me alone. He would ask them if they're Jewish, and didn't want to be bothered by this Jaime from Brooklyn, you understand? So they would tell them they're not Jewish, bug off. So he would simply repeat their words. You're not a Jew. And they would get so disturbed. It didn't happen once, it happened almost consistently. When I say I'm not Jewish, I've got it figured out. When you tell me I'm not a Jew, don't you tell me I'm not Jewish. I'm more Jewish than Moses. So even the perfect Rasha, the Alter Rebbe says that the Shema is always present. So although the Alter Rebbe devotes 4.5 lines to describing how disconnected the perfect Rasha is, he finds a positive spin on it. So in summary, what did we learn? There's a category of a Jew called a Rasha. Now, in tradition, Rasha means a sinner, an evil person. In the Tanya, Rasha simply means not only he's uninspired, but he's compromised. And the beginning of compromise is weakness, and the beginning of weakness is temptation. And the solution to all of that is tshuva. The problem with tshuva is that we got to really change. And we don't want to do that. We want to quasi-change. We want to change for a couple of days a week, from time to time. Okay. Now, the Pedic may be a little difficult to listen to, but one thing you cannot deny is that it's quite true what the Alter Rebbe has to say. It's not Ein Sof. This is very real. This is life. Okay.